President Biden said the United States will not provide F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine when asked yesterday. Let's watch.
Will the United States provide F-16s to Ukraine?
No.
This comes despite other European allies' eagerness to provide such jets, with Macron telling reporters in The Hague on Monday that, by definition, nothing is excluded when it comes to military assistance. Just a week ago, the United States and Germany announced plans to also provide Ukraine with heavy tanks.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said on Sunday that the situation in the country is, quote, very tough. There are constant Russian attacks. There are constant attempts to break through our defenses. We have to speed up events, speed up supplies, and open up new weapons options for Ukraine, end quote. So, people have been pointing out that there's an escalation and it's not clear when it's going to stop. If you understand the context of this engagement being that Russia is infinitely militarily more capable and superior to Ukraine, despite Ukraine being able to hold off Russia, them existing in a stalemate for much of the winter. The final outcome of this, no one really contemplates as Ukraine defeating Russia. So the question is, are the provisions that are being given to Ukraine by these Western countries, by NATO, by the United States, actually bringing it closer to ending this conflict or extending the conflict? In front of the show, Glenn Greenwald has pointed out that, first they asked for, we said we would never send Patriot defense missiles, and then we sent them. That we never sent, as we said we were never going to send these Abrams tanks, and then we're sending tanks. And now Biden has said we're not sending these airplanes, but Zelensky has gone and asked other members of the European Union, and it seems like it's an open question as to whether or not he's going to be able to get them from France or Germany. And is that escalation going to end up getting us to a place where there is a direct conflict between a NATO country, NATO weapons, and Russia that basically takes us from a proxy war into full-blown war between nuclear powers?
Yeah, and that's the grave concern that has always been present here. At what point does Russia say, you have declared war on me? You're arming the country I am trying to wrongly invade, again, Russia, the aggressor here, but it brings us closer to peril. It really does. And we don't know how all these weapons are going to be used. We don't know who our friends and allies who end up with a lot of this equipment will be years from now. That's the situation we found ourselves in the Middle East when we were arming people who later became Al-Qaeda, or were Al-Qaeda, who were fighting us eventually. Our allies have changed hands several times. We killed some of our allies and wanted different ones, and then got fighting with them. So we don't know, and it seems to me, and again, it is one thing to supply weaponry and also push for diplomatic and say this is it. We don't want your country to get overrun right now. The Ukrainians are, again, defending their homeland from military aggression. But like you said, no one expects this to end with the fall of the Russian government, with Ukrainian troops, marching into Russia, conquering the capital and deposing Vladimir Putin and installing a different government. I mean, that's very unlikely to happen. So how do we bring this to an end where both sides can withdraw, where there is maybe an agreement, where maybe Russia is satisfied that those easternmost portions of Ukraine are independent or are doing self-governance, have the kind of government that the inhabitants of those regions actually want to have, and then the rest of Ukraine is still Ukraine and is still under Zelensky's control, or whatever government ends up being chosen by the people, and in the future has the support of NATO countries, if not being part of NATO, that it doesn't get invaded. Let's work out something like that. But is that what's happening?
Yeah, this is why I think the mainstream account of what precipitated this crisis, this is why it matters that it's basically very much representing what precipitated the crisis. Because, part of what the problem is you mentioned Ukraine can be under whatever democratic control. There is a question of whether or not the West has been overly involved in the project of picking who is in control in Ukraine, who is leading Ukraine. And the over-involvement, the Maidan coup, the Victoria Nuland leaked tape where she's talking about picking Ukraine's next leader, all of those kinds of things are in the mix when you're trying to understand the mental state, not the whether or not what Putin said is right or wrong, but the mental state that has led to this kind of a conflict. And when you raise the questions like you just raised, like the good question of what does self-determination look like for Eastern Ukraine, that's a very difficult question. And the difficulties resolving that question are in part why we ended up in this quagmire to begin with. Because from Russia's perspective, and I'm not crediting this, but you have to understand the game, like the perceptions that are driving behavior. From Russia's perspective, there was a basically bidding war between over Ukraine and whether or not they were going to move to the left and take on kind of the IMF austerity that is required to be a part of the West, which comes at the expense of the people of Ukraine and the austerity measures that the West always imposes on these kinds of governments when we bring them into our fold, lowering minimum wages, austerity, broadly speaking, and the more a choice to align more strongly with Russia. And that tug of war and Ukraine's ultimate choice to lean toward Russia was the preempting cause for the 2014 coup and the stream of events that has led to today. So, I wish we were hearing more news reports about what negotiations look like, what the consensus is that's starting to come out of Eastern Ukraine. I know feelings have changed as the war has gone on for understandable reasons. But that seems to me to be what should be the focus of this conversation, instead of these endless reports of weapons provisions that aren't connected to any conversation of how this conflict actually resolves.
Trump said recently that, if he was president, this never would have happened if he had been reelected. If he was president, he would end this immediately. Obviously, Trump is a boastful person, has been accused of being too close to Vladimir Putin. The mainstream media hated the relationship Trump had with Vladimir Putin, acted as if Trump was a stooge, actually, for Putin, that Putin was able to affect U.S. policy through his puppet-like maneuverings of Donald Trump. I think it's an open question. What do you think might be different if Trump was president instead of Joe Biden?
I mean, it's not just Trump, right? It's also Barack Obama who made the choice not to get military involved when Russia annexed Crimea. I mean, these are decisions that have been made not to engage with Russia as a nuclear power by basically everybody except for Joe Biden. So I think it's a good question. It's not clear to me that the United States would be involved in this situation in the same way if Trump were president, although, of course, a lot of people think that's a bad thing. They think that would be evidence of Trump's close relationship with, collusion with Russia, fidelity to Russia in a kind of traitorous way, which, is their right. But I think that everyone, even if you very much support giving military aid to Ukraine, has to ask the question of how you prevent this from becoming the next Afghanistan. No matter how righteous you believe the intervention to be.
Which is what the Hillary Clinton type people want it to be. They want it to become the next Afghanistan because it bleeds Russia.
Yes, it bleeds Russia. It feeds our national security state, our weapons manufacturing.
The neoconservative interventionist type people.
Absolutely. Absolutely, which is the blob is bipartisan.
The blob,
unfortunately. So people have to start answering that question, and it's not enough to say they need us. The Ukrainians need us. Well, the world is big and terrible, and there are a lot of people who I think would benefit from a lot of different types of aid, military and humanitarian and otherwise. And yet we're involved in this conflict because through statements we've heard from the State Department and elsewhere, we want to weaken Russia. The goal is to weaken Russia. The goal is to weaken Putin. And I'm not sure that especially given the crisis that exists domestically, where people are paying a king's ransom for a dozen eggs, that's exactly what the American taxpayer wants people to be doing, the government to be doing.
Because if that is the goal, we could be at it forever.
Correct.
Just as there were people who wanted us in Iraq and Afghanistan forever. It's like, well, when can we get troops out? When is enough? And when caught in a moment of honesty, they would say, well, yeah, so what if we're here in the next 100 years?
Yeah.
It's in service of a noble goal. We will fight the terrorists here instead of at home, or whatever justification they were giving for it. But in their moments of honesty, they would say, no, we will have a presence here forever.
$8 trillion estimated cost for the 20-year war in Afghanistan. $8 trillion. What could you do with $8 trillion, Robby?
I would just start writing checks, giving tax money back to the people who paid it.
I mean, look. Yes.
We could fund some of your social programs, I guess.
A little healthcare, please. Just a bit.
Okay, all right. If you
all right.
Briahna. More Rising right after this.